Every time I am invited to give a lecture, the work that the various pro-Palestinian organizations and pro-justice organizations do often seems small to the organizations themselves working within their communities, but you guys are absolutely changing the world. You're changing the conversation on Palestine. And over the last 6-7 years, the conversation on Palestine in this country has changed so dramatically that I don't think anybody could have anticipated. And it's the work of young students on campuses, and of course all the peace and justice groups. Certainly the Presbyterian Church has been leading the pack on the issue of Palestine and doing a fantastic job. And this is how it's done. But as we've seen over the last several weeks, it's not enough. It's really not enough. And I think it's important to bring that back to our attention. And what I'm going to try to do today, I'm going to say a few words about Gaza, and the main bulk of my presentation is connecting Gaza back to Palestine. Because the attempt that's being made by Israel and by the US government and by the Europeans is to separate Gaza from Palestine. And they've been very successful. If you're tweeting, use the hashtag Zionism must go. Seriously, okay? Somebody took it out of a lecture that I gave and has been using it, and I've been using it. So use the hashtag Zionism must go. I think this is a very important part of this issue, is that Zionism must go, and it's got to be like some of us are old enough to remember the anti-apartheid slogans in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. But I think over the last few weeks we've been witnessing a lynching of unimaginable proportions, a bloodletting and a massacre right in front of our very eyes in one of the highest profile places on earth, in real time, on television. And we have noticed, and we've seen this take place. We felt the inability, our own inability, to intervene and to stop it. And we've seen the world stand by and allow countless of innocent civilians become victims of a brutality that is absolutely hard to imagine. And what makes it harder to imagine is that it is just in broad daylight. Imagine if we were all sitting here and there was this horrific bloodletting taking place right there, and we were not able to do anything about it. And I think this is what makes it so even more horrific and more difficult for people who care about justice, people who care about humanity, and inevitably care about Palestine. This is the issue. And the attempt that's being made is to somehow isolate Gaza from the rest of the issue. That's why I really like this sticker, and I really encourage everybody to put this on your car. In the parking lot, I saw quite a few. It was actually very encouraging. Put this on your car, because the issue of Gaza cannot be isolated from the rest of Palestine. No aspect of the Palestinian issue can be isolated, which is why Israel and the US and the Europeans are trying to isolate it, because they know that by isolating it, they are stopping the solution. Now, one good example of that is the peace talks. The Europeans, the Americans, the Egyptians, all of these people who like nothing better than to see the Palestinians surrender and die, are all conspiring through this imaginary process called the peace process, something that's been going on for decades now, since the 90s. And then every so often they bring them back, they rekindle them, and they try to bring them back together as though it's another real sincere attempt to bring about peace. And of course they fail. And the reason they fail is because they were never meant to bring to success, to bring about success. The peace talks and all of these so-called efforts to bring about the two-state solution, this imaginary idea of a two-state solution, are all attempts to bring the Palestinians to surrender. And they're all failing because the Palestinians will not surrender and will not go away. And they've been very successful in creating this impression that Palestine is Gaza and the West Bank. Gaza is not I mean, Palestine is not Gaza and the West Bank. Palestine is the Galilee, it's Jerusalem, it's Jaffa, it's Haifa. It's the entire country. And the so-called peace talks, besides leading to nowhere, as we've seen, and making things worse for the Palestinians, have been very successful in creating this impression that there is an Israel and there is a Palestine. And the two countries are at war, and therefore we need peace talks, which of course is not true. And I'll go over quite a few of these issues in my talk tonight, but I think it's extremely important to realize Hamas is not the problem, Gaza is not the problem, the rockets are not the problem, Zionism and Israel is the problem, are the problem. And that's why Zionism has to go is a true statement. This is what we need to focus on. Just like apartheid had to go for there to be justice for people of color in South Africa, and Jim Crow had to go in this country for there to be some kind of justice for people of color in this country. This is a map of what's called the partition plan. And people often wonder or like to discuss how this conflict began. What are the roots of the conflict? And we hear this being said, oh, this has been going on for thousands of years. Those people over there have been killing each other forever. This has been going on for 2,000 years. That's complete nonsense. And I think if we want to look at the roots of the issue, it was basically white people thinking that they could take brown people's land and give it and divide it among themselves. And people talk, particularly in Israel, and the pro-Israeli know-it-alls, they talk about what's called the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was a declaration by Lord Balfour, who was the foreign minister of Britain, promising Palestine to his friend Lord Rothschild, who was a Jewish millionaire. Basically, two white racists, or one white racist, promising another white racist somebody else's country. And people talk about the Balfour Declaration as though it came down with Moses from the mountain. One of the 10 Commandments is the Balfour Declaration. It was a little note. In Israel, almost every city has a Balfour Street, or a Balfour Declaration Plaza or something. But this was the time where people could do that. White people took brown people's land and felt they had the right to kick out the people, take the land, do what they wanted with it. And this was the same idea, and this was the idea upon which Zionism was built. Basically a racist colonialist idea. Then, several decades later, we had the United Nations partition plan. The United Nations felt that they could partition Palestine and give a portion of it to the Jewish people, accepting this very strange idea that Jews are a people as opposed to a religion. But that's a whole other issue. Now, what's interesting, the partition plan took place in 1947. Now, I just want to make it absolutely clear. The reason I'm going back this far in history is because without this, there cannot be a full understanding of what has happened now over the last few weeks in Gaza. It is absolutely connected and related. And to ignore this is ignoring Gaza. That's why I think it's so important. But in 1947, when this resolution was passed, there were about 500,000, or the Jewish community in Palestine numbered about 500,000 people. These were mostly my grandparents' generation who immigrated there, and then my parents' generation who were born there. The Palestinian population in Palestine, the local population, indigenous population, numbered 3 times as many, about 1.5 million. Yet when the United Nations came up with this very simplistic idea of dividing the land and giving it, to the two sides, they decided they were going to give the larger portion of the country to the smaller Jewish community. And that's the map that you can see here. The two parts are not divided. And you have to wonder, what kind of a crazy idea is that? Who in their right mind would agree that the United Nations, or anyone for that matter, would take their country and give the larger portion of it to a community of immigrants who had just arrived, basically? Because they claim that they are the descendants of a tribe that lived there 2,000 years ago, which is what the Zionists claim. They claim that all Jewish people are descendants of an ancient tribe, the Hebrews, who lived in that part of the world some 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. This is the claim. And so they have a right to return. And we'll talk about the right to return in a minute. It's also a very interesting double standard. Now you can see the Gaza Strip already here on that map, except on this map, if you can see the Gaza Strip on the coast there, on the bottom, it kind of extends inland as well. After the United Nations passed this resolution, the Zionists, of course, saw this as a huge accomplishment, a huge victory. And from that moment on, we have two narratives developing, and the two narratives are diametrically opposed. There are two absolutely opposed history, complete opposites. People always look for some kind of a balance, some kind of a place to, some kind of a way to bridge the gap. You cannot bridge a gap when the two stories are diametrically opposed. They don't differ in small details. One story talks about an act of heroism, the few Jews who have just recovered, come out of the Holocaust, the descendants of King David who defeated Goliath, now defeating the Arabs who attacked and wanted to destroy them, and establishing a Jewish state once again in the land of Israel after 2,000 years. Again, it's like a chapter out of the Old Testament. It's so biblical, it's so romantic, it's so believable. The other story talks about a massive campaign of terrorism and ethnic cleansing, at the end of which 2/3 of the population, of the Palestinian population in Palestine, was forced into exile. Hundreds and hundreds of towns and cities were destroyed. And the Zionists were able to conquer almost the entire, about 80% of Palestine. So on the one hand, you've got this story of heroism, which is what I was brought up upon and upon which Americans grew up believing and learning, and people in the West in general. And then you've got the Palestinian story and the Palestinian narrative that has been neglected for decades and was only brought back because people like historians like Ilan Pappé and Avi Shlaim, Israeli historians, who wanted to know how this all worked out, discovered the truth and validated what the Palestinians were saying, and then the story was given some kind of attention. Only when Israelis were saying this, people said that they could have started believing the Palestinians. Because the Palestinians they can't tell the truth, they're biased. This is how we view this issue. So the question that begs to be asked is this: when we see the two communities in 1947, when we take a look at the two communities, they were all both hoping to be recognized as states. But we notice also that the Jewish community, the Zionist community in Palestine, had invested heavily in an armed force, in a militia. The Zionist militia then numbered about 40,000 well-trained armed men. My father was an officer in that militia. On the Palestinian side, there's no equivalent. There's never been a Palestinian militia. There's never been a Palestinian armed force. There's never been a Palestinian army, regular army. Certainly not then. So if that's a true statement, then what about the statement that the Zionists are making and the pro-Israelis are making, that the Arabs attacked the Jews in 1947? Well, if they attacked, what did they attack with? Because they had no weapons, and they had no armed force, and they had no militia. Well, as I said, these are the types of questions that historians like Ilan Pappé and others asked when they went in to discover what actually took place in 1947, 1948, that actually led to this massive ethnic cleansing. And it was a 12-month-long act of terrorism and ethnic cleansing. Now, the reason we have a Gaza Strip to begin with is because the Palestinians who were forced to leave from the southern part of the country, the cities and towns of the southern part of Palestine, were herded into refugee camps around the city of Gaza. The Israeli forces conquered or took that lower strip, that lower brown strip, and that other strip along the coast was maintained, and that's where the refugee camps were built. And to this day, this is the Gaza Strip. And that's why there is a Gaza Strip. Now, this process didn't end until the early 1950s. The ethnic cleansing continued for a few more years after the State of Israel was established. Refugees were pushed into there, and they were not permitted to return. Now, from a nation who claims that they had a right to return because they are the descendants of a tribe from 2,000 years ago, not allowing another nation to return to their homes, even though they still have the keys to their homes. I mean, you're not going to find a single Jewish person who has the keys to their home from 2,000 years ago, or can even trace their history or their family roots that long. Palestinians still have the keys to the home and the deeds to their land. It was 65 years ago. Many of them are still alive. So the world accepts that Jews have a right to return to the land of Israel. But Palestinians know, because this was a long time ago and they have to forget. And this is how this conversation is being conducted. This is serious people say this. Palestinians have to forget because it was a long time ago. 65, 66 years ago. And ever since the Gaza Strip was created, Palestinians have been wanting to return. Of course, Israel passed laws that made it impossible for them to return. And on a regular basis, since the early 1950s, since the Gaza Strip was created, Israeli army units have been going into Gaza and conducting massacres. What we've seen this last few weeks is nothing new. What we saw in Cast Lead is nothing new. It's part of an almost 7-decade-long policy where Israeli forces on a regular basis go in and commit massive assaults against a civilian population that has never had a tank, has never had a warship, has never had a fighter plane, has never had a regular army. On a regular basis, killing civilians. In fact, initially there was a special unit that was headed by Ariel Sharon, a special commando unit that was charged with this, and they had to be dismantled because even Israelis found them to, the level of the massacres and violence, impossible to bear. So that unit was dismantled. And over the years, the technology improved, so the number of civilians killed has risen. Cast Lead, I believe it was about 14 or 1,500. Thankfully, Cast Lead had to end by January 20th, 2009, because Barack Obama's inauguration took place on that day, and you can't have a massacre taking place while he's swearing his oath, taking the oath of office. So they had to stop. Thankfully, they only had 3 weeks. This massacre, there were no such restrictions. So we've passed the 2,000 mark already. And you wonder how many more will die before somebody steps in. But the people in Gaza, the refugees, want to return to their homes, they want to return to their lands, they want their rights, they deserve their rights, and they don't stop fighting. And they don't stop resisting. It's been going on for 6, 7 decades, it will continue. And as long as Israel exists, the violence against Gaza will exist. Because Gaza, and especially the refugees in Gaza, remind Israel and remind the world that Israel is an illegitimate creation that was born of this very unholy, very toxic union between racism and colonialism. And Israel, this brutal entity, this brutal state, is the creation of those two things. And as long as the refugees are there, poor, and living in dire conditions, in stark contrast to the wealth and the security and the safety that exists in Israel, and the abundance, people can see. People are reminded of this horrible sin, of this original sin of the creation of the State of Israel. And that's why Israel will continue to bomb and kill Gaza, because the only other solution is a solution that will solve the problem and allow the refugees to return. And it's impossible to talk about Gaza without talking about what happened in 1948 and the rest of Palestine and what all Palestinians have suffered. The two things are connected and cannot be isolated. I'm going to talk a little bit about this claim that we hear quite a lot. We heard about answering the claims of the Zionists. That actually maybe a few Arabs were forced to leave and maybe there were a few towns that were destroyed, but basically there was nothing there in Palestine. It was barren desert. The Arabs were just, primitive and there was nothing there. And anything that came that's of value to Palestine was brought by the Jews, by the Jewish immigrants, by the Zionists. So I'd like to show this picture of the city of Jaffa. It was a city of some 100 or 120,000 people, with a rich business life and a rich political life and trade unions and writers' guilds and several newspapers that were printed and concert halls and movie theaters. A major city, a major Arab city on the coast of the Mediterranean. And in a matter of 2 weeks in 1948, the city of some 120,000 was reduced to less than 4,000 people, concentrated in one neighborhood with barbed wires and Israeli soldiers around them. And on the ashes of this very city, today, We have the modern Israeli city of Tel Aviv, almost a picture almost taken from the exact same angle. And today there still is a Palestinian community in Jaffa, very small, neglected, oppressed, subject to harassment by the Israeli security forces, not unlike Palestinians in other parts of the country. And these Palestinians are Israeli citizens. Neglect, poverty, unemployment, you name it. And total, consistent harassment by the Israeli security services. And this is true all over Palestine. So it's important to understand this, not to see just the historical context, but also to bring back to light the fact that Palestine is the entire country. Jaffa is part of Palestine, even today. As is Gaza, as is Jerusalem, as is the Galilee, and so on, and Ramle and Lud and all the other cities. And we see the same symptoms. The laws are still a little bit different. The laws in the West Bank are military laws. The laws that discriminate against Palestinians inside who are Israeli citizens happen to be civil laws, but it doesn't matter because the result is the same. Harassment, neglect, racism, and violence. Because they are Palestinians, because they are non-Jews. The poverty that exists in Palestinian refugee camps, the lack of employment and so forth. When we look at a picture like this, and then we know that a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles away, we have modern cities that look like this, you have to wonder why. Why do these children have to live like this? Why are they not, number one, allowed to go back to their homes, or the homes of their parents and grandparents? And number two, why are they forced to live like this? When a mile, 2 miles away, we have complete modern cities with medical facilities and running plenty of water and plenty of food. Imagine as a parent, and forget for a moment the violence, the missiles, and the bombs falling from the air and so forth. Imagine something simple. As a parent, a child with an ear infection, and there's no access to antibiotics. Inside of Israel, you wouldn't imagine something like this. A mile away in Gaza or other refugee camps, no access to the basic most health care. This is not some, remote village in Afghanistan or somewhere. This is a mile away from modern cities, 20 minutes from Tel Aviv, half an hour from Jerusalem. Modern cities where you wouldn't dream of not having basic medicine and so forth, clean water. And this is a process, and this is a reality that goes on every single day, and has been going on every single day since 1948, and continues under our watch, and is paid for by American tax money. $3-4 billion every year goes to maintain this. Because the Israeli army has one purpose, and that is to maintain this. And the state of Israel does everything it can to maintain this, and the United States is giving the money to do this. And that is what is so unjustifiable and inexcusable. And then on a regular basis, from time to time, as we've seen, massive military force attacking these people. People that have never had a tank, have never had a warplane, have never had a warship, have never had a regular army, that pose no threat to anyone other than the legitimacy of the state of Israel, which is why they're being punished. And when we talk today people are talking about the ceasefire, yes ceasefire, no ceasefire. Basically, we have the US, the Egyptians, and the Israelis trying to get the Palestinians to surrender. And it's quite amazing to see the staying power of the Palestinians in light of the horrendous amounts of violence that they've suffered. And what are they asking for? Not to go back to the reality that existed before the attacks. Lifting of the siege, allowing freedom of movement, allowing freedom of goods, allowing freedom of, to have access to medicine and clean water. This is what they're asking for, and release of prisoners. We'll talk about the prisoners in a minute. Now I'm going to go back a little bit into my own kind of story, my own personal story, which is really what my book is about. And people always ask, so how did you learn about this? I mean, I grew up in a very patriotic Zionist Israeli family. My father was a general. My grandfather signed the Declaration of Independence. This is, as patriotic of an Israeli upbringing as you could possibly imagine. And there's never one thing that brings about change. It's always little things that at some point come together. And this is a picture of my mother. My mother, in fact, today turns 88. Today's her birthday. And this is her when she's about 22. Now, she was born and raised in Jerusalem. And there's a story that she told me many, many times as I was growing up about her experience in 1948. Now, having been born and raised in Jerusalem, she knew the city well. She knew the different neighborhoods, the Palestinian neighborhoods, the Jewish neighborhoods, and so forth. And in 1948, the Zionist militia came and took the Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem. And I'm not talking about the old city. I'm talking about the city that later on became Israel, the western side of the city. And there were big neighborhoods, very prominent families that lived there. In fact, the homes are still there, the neighborhoods are still there, just the people were forced to leave. And in 1948, when the Zionist forces came in, they forced the people to leave. And the homes, beautiful, very distinct Jerusalemite Palestinian homes, were made available to Israeli families. Now, my mother was a young mother already at the time. She was living in a small apartment with her parents, and she was offered one of these beautiful homes. And she refused. And she was only about 22 years old. And the way she told me the story many, many times growing up, and the way she still talks about it, is with such passion. She said, how could I possibly take the home of another mother? How could I possibly move into the home of another family that now has to live in exile, and how they must miss their home? And these are beautiful homes with a lemon tree in the front usually, and a nice garden in the back, and so forth. Now, it's a wonderful story, and of course she did the right thing, and we're all very happy that she did. Sadly, not many people did what she did. Most people took the homes. But for me, as a child growing up in Israel, as a youth as well, this story was a big problem, and I remember it sitting in the back of my head, and I had a problem with the story. And only when I was actually working on the book over the last few years, I realized the reason I had a problem with the story is because it pokes holes in the national narrative. It contradicts the national narrative. The Zionist narrative is foolproof. It's morally perfect. The land is our land. We were exiled some 2,000-3,000 years ago, and now we're back. We're the descendants of King David and the Maccabees and so on. And now we're back. We agreed to accept the partition plan and allow the Arabs to stay and live in part of this land. They rejected it, and then they attacked us. Thankfully, we won because we're smarter and better and faster and so forth. And then we asked the Arabs to stay, and they left. We asked them to stay, and they all got up and left. Where's the moral dilemma? Why was my mother presenting a moral dilemma in a story in which there is no moral dilemma? It's morally perfect. Even when Israelis do talk about atrocities that were committed, and we do learn about, I remember learning about, and I know they still learn about, for example, the massacre of Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin was a small village on the outskirts of Jerusalem. When the Zionist forces came, the village surrendered, but they came into the village and committed a terrible massacre. It's not the only place, but it's the most well-known instance. And we do learn about this, and Israelis do learn about this, but they also learn at the end of the same chapter that important leaders said, Zionist leaders said, that while the massacre was a terrible thing, thankfully as a result of the massacre, thousands of Arabs fled, which allowed us to establish a Jewish majority. And we don't have to say this, we all understand, there is nothing more important than a Jewish majority in the land of Israel. And it goes on today. Israel, I was in Israel now. I was there now for the last 6 weeks. I just got back. On television, all the Israeli news channels show everything that's taking place in Gaza. The number of children that are being killed, the number of women that are being killed, the families that are being killed in bulk, mosques and hospitals that are being attacked. But it's fine because it's Hamas, you see. So even though we're doing all these terrible things, it's okay because Hamas is in Gaza and they're the devil. So morally, we're okay. And you talk to anybody in the streets and everybody agrees. So the Zionist story is always perfect. It's always morally perfect. And again, like I said, the story that she told was poking holes in this perfectly moral story. Now, this is what the map looked like at the end of, once the State of Israel was established after 1948, this was what the map was looked like. Israel had occupied almost all of Palestine, with the exception of the West Bank and Gaza. And then 1967 war came around, and basically this is what took place. Israel erased, after the 1967 war, Israel erased Palestine off the map completely and established the State of Israel, creating a single state with exclusive rights for Jewish people over the entire country. Now, they call it a Jewish state. I would argue there's nothing Jewish about the State of Israel. Most Jews don't live there, never have, never will. The majority of people who do live there today are not Jewish. Palestinians are the majority. The State of Israel does not uphold any Jewish values. Holding thousands of political prisoners does not represent Jewish values. Denying children water because they're not Jewish is not Jewish values. Bombing Gaza and killing countless civilians is not Jewish values. And having racist laws that discriminate against non-Jews is not Jewish values. There's nothing Jewish about the State of Israel, which leads us, by the way, there's nothing anti-Semitic about criticizing Israel, because there's nothing Jewish. It does not represent anything Jewish. They happen to be Jews. That's the only thing. These racist colonialists happen to be Jewish, but they don't represent all Jews, thankfully. And this is important to understand, again, in light of all this talk about two-state solution, and about the two-state solution, and about the peace talks. Israel took the West Bank in a war that lasted 6 days in 1967. Okay? The war had just barely ended when Israeli bulldozers were already destroying Palestinian neighborhoods and Palestinian towns and building neighborhoods for Israeli Jews only on that land. The war had barely ended when the Israeli army declared the water in the West Bank belonging to the State of Israel. You may know this, but one of the largest water sources in the country is in the West Bank. It's called the Mountain Aquifer. And almost immediately, Israel began investing billions and billions of dollars in building cities and towns and highways and industries and shopping malls in the West Bank, which, by the way, is exactly what they did in the rest of the country after 1948. So what in all of this gives us the impression that they will one day allow the Palestinians to establish a Palestinian state there? What in all of this gives us the notion that peace can be made with Israel based on a two-state solution? You have to be hallucinating to believe that there could be a peace with Israel that will bring a solution to the question of Palestine. You have to be completely drunk or on drugs to think that this is a possibility, or completely naive. The West Bank was taken and integrated into the rest of the country immediately and by design. I have a copy of a lecture my father gave in 1953 as a young officer, explaining to a gathering of Jewish donors who came to visit Israel that the army is waiting for the order to take the West Bank because the Jordan River is the natural eastern boundary of the State of Israel. In 1967, the opportunity presented itself, and they took it. And to think that that State of Israel, that this Zionist regime will allow a Palestinian state, will allow Palestinians any rights within these boundaries, it's either folly or ignorance. And this is why the history of this country, of the last 6 or 7 decades, is so important to understand. This is a picture of my father, by the way. And he played an important role, not only in the war and the military, but afterwards as well. After the 6-Day War the 67 war had ended, and he was he was a member of the Israeli High Command, the Israeli Army High Command. He stood up and he actually said, you know what? Now we need to make peace with the Palestinians. We should not occupy the West Bank. We should allow the Palestinians to establish a state in the West Bank, because that is how we maintain a Jewish state. If we take the West Bank, we are taking on millions of Palestinians. We will be a foreign and alien occupation. They will fight us. There will be a resistance. And we're going to spend years and resources fighting this resistance. And eventually we're going to become a binational state. He said this in 1967. Every single word of what he said then actually came true. It was absolutely true. Now he retired about a year later from the military, and then he dedicated the rest of his life to that end, to talk about the rights of Palestinians within the West Bank to establish a state, and the rights of Palestinians who are Israeli citizens to equal rights. And he believed that there could be this, and he wasn't the only one, there were several other Zionists who believed there could be this more moderate aspect of Zionism. As we see today, he was wrong. He passed away in 1995 at the height of Oslo. And he was one of the first people who said that Oslo was a catastrophe, that Oslo was not going to lead to peace, that Rabin, who signed the Oslo Accords, does not want peace. But he actually read the Oslo Accords, which most people didn't. The claim we hear all the time is, of course, that Israel wants peace, but there's nobody to talk to on the other side. My father, like I said, continued to promote this idea, and he and several other Israelis had an organization that they established in the early 70s to that end. And immediately they were contacted by members of the PLO, members of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat's closest aides, who wanted to explore this idea of maybe the two-state solution is this good solution. And this was in the 1970s. So they would meet, at first it was in secret, they would meet in Europe, they would meet in North Africa, and whenever they'd come back, my father would always go to the Prime Minister's office to report. He had that kind of access still in those days. The Israeli government wanted nothing to do with this. In the 80s, this group of my father and others actually met with Yasser Arafat in a highly publicized meeting in Tunis. Shortly after that, the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli parliament, passed a law that made it illegal for these people to meet with the PLO. A specific law made for these people doing the work that they do. They ignored it. They said, you can arrest us. They kept talking. This was in the 80s. And then suddenly in 1993, we have the Oslo Peace Accords, and everybody's thinking, the world is changing. Israel really wants peace. The Berlin Wall had fallen, apartheid South Africa had fallen. Maybe it's Palestine's turn to bring about peace. Maybe Israel really wants peace. I think the fact that Rabin was the man behind it, Rabin and Peres, two people that have a record of war crimes that is impossible to even to list, it's so long, that these people suddenly were behind this peace process. But the reality was, of course, that the purpose of the Oslo Accord, and like I said earlier, the purpose of the peace process is not to bring about peace, it's to bring about the surrender of the Palestinians. And they were hoping that they could convince Arafat and his aides to come in with the hopes of one day having a Palestinian state, but knowing full well that their intention was to bring the Palestinians to surrender and to be totally dependent on the state of Israel, which is, of course, what took place. Now, Oslo didn't fail. People think the Oslo process failed. The Oslo process didn't fail. The Oslo process was a massive success. It accomplished everything it set to do. The reality that exists in Palestine today, particularly the difficulties in life for Palestinians, are all a result of the Oslo process, and this is exactly what they were set to do, to make life unlivable for Palestinians, so that they would either leave or die. The wall, the settlements, what they call the settlements, which is really cities and towns in the West Bank, the distribution of water, the lack of distribution of water. Can you imagine a neighborhood across the street from here that only gets 12 hours of water per week? And over here we have this homes with green lawns and swimming pools. And across the street there's a neighborhood that gets 12 hours of water per week. Why? Because, this is all a part of Oslo. This is all a part of the peace process. And it's not bringing about peace because it wasn't meant to bring about peace. It was meant to bring about surrender. And the Palestinians, darn it, will not surrender. In fact, they keep growing. The population grows. Now, again, another issue that ties us back to Gaza is the issue of the resistance and the political prisoners. One of the Palestinians' demands in Gaza for a ceasefire is release of prisoners. Now, Israel has thousands and thousands of Palestinian political prisoners that it's had in its jails for years, for decades. The vast majority of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails have not been charged with acts of violence. Now you have to understand that we're talking about military courts. The bar is set so low that a kid with a rock is a terrorist. And the vast majority of Palestinian prisoners, the thousands of prisoners in Israeli jails, and this is according to Israeli reports, have never been charged with acts of violence. They're not terrorists. They're political prisoners. And of course, then you have hundreds of those who are under administrative detention that have not been charged with anything at all. Like Samir Isawi and his sister in this picture. Samir Isawi, you may remember a couple of years ago, he holds the record for the number of days of hunger strike. He went on a hunger strike and he broke every record. Nobody thought he would survive. Thankfully he did. I believe he's back in jail now again, as is his sister. No charges brought against them. So even by the low bar of the Israeli military courts, there's nothing with which they could charge these people, yet they arrest them anyway. Hundreds of them, including women and minors. And again, one of the demands of the Palestinians in Gaza for a ceasefire is the release of these prisoners. But besides this, we have to understand that resistance to occupation and oppression is something that the world community has accepted as acceptable, as legal. This is a bit from United Nations General Assembly resolution from November of 1974. It's in addition to a resolution that already existed. And it reaffirms the legitimacy of people's struggle for liberation from colonial and foreign domination and alien subjugation, which really is exactly what Israel is, by all available means, including armed struggle. If Israel does not like rockets flying out of Gaza, Israel has the possibility of ending the oppression and ending the occupation. The burden is on the occupier. The burden is on the power that is oppressing, not on the oppressed, to stop resisting. When they behave well, we'll see. The international community recognizes the rights of people to resist, even using armed resistance, armed struggle. And as the Palestinian prisoner population demonstrates, the vast majority of the Palestinian struggle has not been armed from the very beginning, and certainly today. The vast majority of the Palestinian resistance is unarmed. It always has been unarmed. But to expect that people will live like this, any of us will live like this and not resort to armed struggle, at least some kind of armed resistance, even as ineffective as it may be. And we know that these rockets, I was there, the rockets fall in empty fields. So we have to recognize, again, like I said, Hamas is not the problem. Hamas is a resistance organization. It never would have been established if there wasn't an oppression and occupation. I'm not making this up. You can read about this. This is all stuff that's been written about, that's well known. Exactly when Hamas was established and why. As a resistance organization, as part of the Palestinian resistance to the oppression and the occupation. And I remember an interview my father gave once as a retired general. People asked him, how can you possibly sit and talk with terrorists? He said, well, terrorism is a terrible thing. Of course, at the same time, when a smaller nation is occupied and oppressed by a larger power, quite often there's no other resort. They have no other option. And this is precisely why the United Nations passed this resolution and why the international community holds these people as heroes eventually, not at the time when this is happening, usually later on. These people are held as heroes for fighting this brutality, for fighting the oppression, for fighting the occupation. And this is something we have to start talking about and not being afraid. If Israel does not like rockets, the power is with Israel's hands to stop them tomorrow by releasing the prisoners, lifting the siege, and I think they should pay for the damage in Gaza and pay for allow for the repatriation of the Palestinian refugees back to their homes. It's all within the power of Israel, and this is all what I think Israel eventually will be made to do if we all do what we're supposed to do. I'll tell you another part of my own story, again, that leads to how I came from where I came in terms of my upbringing to the way I speak today. And that has to do with the fact that my sister's daughter was victim to a suicide attack. She was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem in 1997. And this is her, Smadar. She was 13 years old. And this is always big news in Israel, of course, but in this case it was bigger news because this is the granddaughter of a famous general, and a famous general who became an advocate for Palestinian rights. And I was already living here in the US. I took the first plane home when I heard, and when I got to my sister's apartment, it was packed with people who came to mourn, both Israelis and Palestinians, but with the press. Every press agency you can imagine, in every language, in every country that you can imagine was there. And when my sister came out to finally talk to everyone, she started answering questions. Of course, the first question is about retaliation and revenge and how hard do we get them and how many do we kill. And she said, no real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. Don't talk to me about killing more people. And in terms of who's responsible, she said, well, who is it that has taken Palestinian land, destroyed Palestinians' homes, threw Palestinians' fathers and brothers and mothers in jail, and is shooting young Palestinians in the schoolyard? It's the Israeli government. It's we, with this brutal oppression and the brutal occupation, that are responsible for this. And what do we expect? That there will be no price to pay? This is what you pay when you maintain this kind of oppression, this kind of brutality. And both she and her husband said clearly that they hold the Israeli government responsible for their daughter's death. And to this day, they've been active, very active on this issue. So for me, this was, of course, not only for me, for a lot of people, this was a shock. Here's an Israeli mother who just buried her daughter, and she's turning everything upside down, because we know that the Israelis are victims, the Palestinians are terrorists, Israelis want peace, Palestinians don't want peace, and she just turned everything upside down. And my story was, I came back to the US, and I was very fortunate to find a kind of a Jewish-Palestinian discussion group, and I began attending, and that was my first experience meeting Palestinians. Now, I was born and raised in Jerusalem, which is supposed to be a mixed city. But if you've been to Jerusalem, you may have seen it's a very segregated city. It's a completely racist city. There's no place where Israelis and Palestinians meet. Any kind of a meeting with any kind of substance. And so in fact, the chapter in the book that talks about my journey starts with the line, my journey into Palestine began in San Diego. I was 39 years old. And that was the first time I met and I heard this narrative, I heard about the Nakba and so forth. And it wasn't a pleasant process. I mean, the people were very kind, I have to say, and very generous in allowing me to go through this very difficult process. But realizing that the story that you grew up to believe in is so much a part of you. The story of 1948, the story of the heroism, or the myth, I should say, is very much a part of Israeli identity. It's very much who you are when you're an Israeli. Well, if this is not true, what does that make me? So I went through that process thanks to them, and then began traveling into the West Bank and so forth, and realizing what I'd expressed to you tonight. I'll go back now, or I'll end with where we go from here, and a little bit of what I said in the beginning. We have to recognize that there are two options, and none of them have to do with separating the country or creating two states within that country. The two options that exist today are accepting what we have today, which is a single state over all of Palestine with exclusive rights for Jewish people. Again, recognizing it's not a Jewish state, there's nothing Jewish about it, but except for the fact that it provides exclusive rights for Jewish people, or the creation of a real democracy with equal rights. Now, many people say they support Israel. Even Jimmy Carter, God bless him, says he supports Israel. Well, we have to understand, if we support the state of Israel, if anybody supports the state of Israel, it's a package deal. What we saw in Gaza over the last few weeks is part of that. The thousands of political prisoners, that's part of that. The racist laws, that's part of that. Denying children water because they're not Jewish, that's part of that. You can't only support the little bit of Israel that you like, the 3 or 4 peaceniks. If you support Israel, that's Israel. The only way to have a Jewish state or a so-called Jewish state in an Arab country is with all of that baggage. And anybody who supports it has to come clean and admit, I am a racist. I support a racist regime. I support the killing of innocent civilians. I support a state that has thousands of political prisoners, and that's who I am. And there are many people who supported apartheid in South Africa and this country as well. We know very well. The struggle to bring about a boycott of South Africa in this country was just as tough. And talk to anybody, all the veterans from that struggle, they'll tell you. It wasn't until the mid or late 80s that you got Americans to agree to boycott South Africa. Of course, by 1993, 1994, Mandela was already president. So it was pretty late in the game. So anybody who supports that, admit, I support that, I'm a racist, and that's how it's going to be. A lot of people supported Jim Crow in this country. Of course, today all these people are hard to find. They forgot. And I suspect it'll be the same thing in 10 years. People who today claim they support the state of Israel proudly will hide in some corner and hope nobody's watching, nobody's paying attention, because it's the same thing. The struggle today for people of conscience has to be to end Zionism. Just like apartheid had to end in South Africa, Zionism has to end in Palestine. Jews do not have any rights in Palestine. Israelis like myself, we're like the whites in South Africa. We are the children of settlers and colonizers, but this is our home now for those who live there. That's the reality that exists today. Anybody who doesn't like to live in a reality where there are two nations will have to leave. There's no other point. There's no other choice. This is what exists there today. But the two nations, Israelis and Palestinians, who live there today, have the potential to create a productive, functioning democracy the next day, once equal rights are extended to everyone. We have two highly educated societies. Even in Gaza today, literacy rates are some of the highest in the world, 92% literacy rate, even in Gaza, with all the difficulties. Mothers and fathers are still sending their kids to school. They have something like 8 universities in Gaza, in the Gaza Strip. Two societies that are highly professional, that have traditions of democracy, that know how to function as a state. The missing link is the equal rights. The thing that is in the way is the Zionist regime. It's the idea of the state of Israel, the Jewish state, and that is what has to go. So is it anti-Semitic? No. Are we talking about another Holocaust? Of course not. Nobody's talking about killing anyone. We're talking about including everyone. We're getting rid of this exclusive regime in favor of an inclusive state that includes everyone. Now, many of you, I saw earlier, have been there. You know it's a beautiful country with tremendous potential. I urge you, put one of these on your car and understand that talking about free Palestine means freeing Palestine from Zionism and creating a real democracy. Thank you all very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.